Mijai Hasema. Medasi.
That's it. Good evening. Senior your sister Kayan, or your mama Kayan, and your topic, yeah, be discuss and I be come assembly, a child abuse and neglect. And son of Meshasi, I think Sir Auntie Becky are there. I think so called, sorry, with Queen's Ghana. And so, if it's a auntie and all the people who came online to listen, thank you for coming. And then, as I said, child abuse and neglect. Things say a topic is very important because if you don't have the proper information, and I said there's no awareness about it, it's very easy said you get caught up in either a court case or something concerning it. And so, and then we just want to break down what child abuse and neglect is. So, and then specifically, Rebecca, what is child abuse and neglect? The 4 types of child abuse, the effects of child abuse and neglect, and then prevention at the family and church levels. So, we'll call federal definition of child abuse and neglect. Most child abuse is defined as any recent act or failure to act. So, adia will be an answer, adia wunye, it will end up resulting in the death, the serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or even an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. So basically, the Omo kind of idea will be a deal war, a bit pra, and I said this sexual abuse or exploitation, a bit bra. That is what they define federally as child abuse and neglect. In New York, specifically, state of New York, since the year program we for New York, they define child abuse and neglect as the act or failure to act by any parent or caretaker that results in the death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation of a child under the age of 18. So my definition is very similar to the federal definition, but the only thing on my sister is classifying is that any child and would be in VA 18 or under. Specifically in the state of New York, physical discipline, or spanking, as how they pronounce it, or how they say it. They say it is if it is reasonable, or if set in prakolana, they allow it. However, they say it's in reasonable limits, and only key word, reasonable, and definition of reasonable is the court's definition of reasonable, meaning says so for whatever reason, court case it's possible said by case basis. They can define that is it abuse or is it not abuse? Right now, there's a bit of conflict between the New York appellate court definition of abuse and the New York family court of abuse. The appellate court says any child under the age of 21 and under. And a family court says anybody under the age of 18. With this conflict, what has resulted in this, if even though maybe the reasonable, maybe person did it over, not so person correct over, and then it ends up somebody from the outside, whether a neighbor or down for whoever, goes to report it to the Child Protective Services, and then it becomes a court case. It's possible, even if you're not arrested and I'm unchargeable for any child abuse, it's possible, Child Protective Services and not CPS still be done into a case. And so then they can investigate, and based on more recommendation and more judgment, and on our court's liberty. And so it's important to say, even though spanking and is allowed, you use caution, you exercise caution when you choose to do it, because it goes overboard or becomes excessive. It's possible they can classify it or deem it as abuse. Some myths and facts about child abuse. Many times people believe abuse, it's only abuse if it's violent. But that is not true. The fact is that physical abuse, and I said abuse, I would or something like that. There's just one type of child abuse. There's also sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. And those types of abuses, it can inflict the same amount of damage or just as much damage as physical abuse. Another myth that people believe is that so be child abuser, that means or a stranger or there's somebody who's not part of the family. But research shows that most abusers only family members or only in bang now they're close to the family. And so this tells us that we should be keen about the people we have in close relation to our family. Another myth that people believe is that abuse does not happen in good families. Good meaning say, maybe it's a good neighborhood, these things of that. So that means abuse in those kinds of families, it can't happen or it shouldn't happen, right? But the truth is that abuse and neglect does not only happen in poor families or bad neighborhoods. Abuse, the idea, it cuts across racial, economic, and cultural lines. It means that whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, abuse is something that can happen within your family or within your community. There are 4 different types of physical or child abuse. The first one is physical abuse. Physical abuse, definitions, but the specific definition for physical abuse, I'm going to define it as any non-accidental physical injury to a child, and that may result as a deliberate attempt to hurt a child or excessive physical punishment. Meaning, so what like you have mean that can be classified as physical abuse. And sometimes, even if you don't mean it, let's say, you tell your child, say, okay, or I want to do this to correct you. If it goes overboard or it becomes excessive, where they end up injured or anything like that, though one said that, it can also still be classified as physical abuse. However, the key point we really focus on is that there's a difference between using physical discipline to correct your child and physical abuse. When you would discipline to discipline them, it means that at the end like you want to teach them a lesson. It doesn't mean that you're trying to punish them. Sometimes, if you are trying to punish that and you're doing it out of anger, and that's what before most times, if you're not careful, that you're able to go overboard to the point a bit done it physical abuse because I call to me pra. And so it's important, says, especially as a Christopher, when we are operating in anger or there's something we want to do to teach our child a lesson, you better take a step back. And we should analyze the situation and say, okay, what do I want my child to learn from this interaction? Because what do I want to teach them? Is it because I want them to fear me or because I want them to learn a lesson? And so it's very important that we know that there's a difference between physical discipline to correct your child and then physical abuse. Examples of physical abuse include hitting with hands. With this one, you are allowed to, of course, it's allowed, but it gets it to a point it leaves a bruise, and I think it's called kucha or something on akolane, or any part of their body has a mark at. It's considered excessive, and so that can be considered physical abuse. So panchino, so shaking them, throwing them, so any form of bone breaking, drowning. Though they seem excessive, they are examples of physical abuse. Some warning signs of physical abuse, meaning say, okay, maybe Akolano, there's a child being physically abused. How do we know says Akolano they're being physically abused? One particular sign you can see, the child has unexplained frequent injuries, burns, bites, bruises, or black marks, or black eyes, sorry. What that means is that they be like maybe a different part of their body is injured. And whenever you ask Sakulana about what has happened, most times they can't explain. It's possible that Sakulana they may be a victim of physical abuse. Another one is that a child who's being physically abused, they may shy away from touch or flinch at sudden movements. Maybe you person would keke, but the way Akolana be reacting, as if it seems as if it's a bono. So those kinds of children, it's possible or be a victim of physical abuse. And another aspect is they seem frightened of parents or afraid to go home. Maybe sorry, obi akofie no no kwa na se ne mama and ne papa friend so onkofie. Now was they start crying and then they start saying, I don't want to go. And you can see said there's some type of fear. It's not said like because Niniaji or sorry, because you can see said there's something frequently said like ne mami and papa. The way they react, you can see say it's possible that they could be a victim of physical abuse. The second type of abuse, emotional abuse. Emotional abuse, is defined as a pattern of behavior that impairs a child's emotional development or sense of self-worth. So how is or feeling about nehono? That is based on idea that can be considered emotional abuse if they feel bad about themselves. And emotional abuse, is a type of abuse. It's subtle. And this physical abuse, burn or some type of mark on their body. It's internal, and so slowly, it begins to chip away at the child's self-esteem, and so they begin to feel so unsafe or unbelonging. That could be a form of emotional abuse or a definition of emotional abuse. And oftentimes, emotional abuse, it can't other kinds of abuse, a bit physical abuse, a bit sexual abuse. So it makes it very difficult to say a bit emotional abuse. Most times, the only way a bit emotional abuse is based on Kolani behavior, the way or the way I obey behavior. And on the better is okay, it's possible that there could be something going on. Some examples of emotional abuse: humiliation. A form of humiliation or an example of that could be said maybe a parent or disciplining the bad they be or in front of other people. They want other people to see say now or correcting the bad. So maybe now bono in front of other or shed as a pass or in front of because they want the child to feel ashamed for now or that form of humiliation can be an example of emotional abuse. Or constant criticism, meaning there's nothing positive about it. Or some always be negative towards Aqualan because of the internal will go through that. It could be emotional abuse. Another one was that rejection and withholding of love, support, or guidance, which means that as a parent, if you are emotionally abusing your child, you could intentionally say, what do you mean, the reason and the reason I hear emotional abuse is because who communicated so to Bana said, if one be so near, and so because of that internalization of it, then they feel sad like, okay, me too, I don't belong, I'm not worthy of love and things of that nature. And so their emotional or mental state, is affected because of that. And because of that, that can be a form of emotional abuse. Another example is exposing a child to violence against others. Specifically, what this is talking about is domestic abuse, meaning say maybe Aqualano in their house, they witness their parents and answer not just any kind of like physical fights. If they're exposed to such a thing emotionally, it has an impact on them. Another sign or warning signs of emotional abuse: excessively withdrawn, fearful or anxious about doing something wrong. Like they isolate themselves. They seem to be scared of everything. Such a child could be going through something or some form of emotional abuse. Some children, they react differently towards this. They may also struggle to control their emotions. Meaning, say 1 minute, not the both, 1 minute, not the niaje, 1 minute, now so soon. Like those things, because it's so how regulating the emotions, or how to express so they don't know how to express themselves. It comes out to say they just end up showing extremes in their behavior. And another key sign or warning sign of emotional abuse is a loss of interest in social activities or other interests. Meaning, say maybe Akolano before, like they like to go outside and play with their friends. But then all of a sudden, that's Akolano, not like they start isolating themselves on maybe Aquilano or soccer, but then all of a sudden on soccer, like you can't get any kind of happiness from this child. That it's possible that that child could be emotionally abused. If not that, something else is going on that needs to be addressed. The third type of child abuse is sexual abuse. Sexual abuse, in the definition, anything that is done with a child for the sexual gratification of an adult, an older child, or adolescent. Meaning, sexual abuse, and then just between it can also be Aquilane or Aquilane, a teenager. And so it's important that we are very particular and keen about our children's interactions with other people, even other children. Sexual abuse, you're categorizing into two different types, contact and non-contact. Contact means that a form of sexual abuse that physically, some form of contact has happened. Non-contact means that physically nothing has happened. Maybe it was virtual, but it can also still be classified as sexual abuse. Some examples of that, contact abuse specifically, it could include touching, kissing, and oral sex. It doesn't necessarily just have to be penetrative. Whether you touch a child's genitals, whether they are wearing clothes or not, a form of sexual abuse. Making a child touch someone else's genitals is also a form of sexual abuse. In terms of non-contact, maybe showing a child pornography, or exposing or flashing your genitals to the child, or even photographing a child in sexual poses or positions, or forcing a child to take part in sexual activities or conversations online or through a smartphone. Forms and examples of sexual abuse. Some warning signs for sexual abuse. A child who may be a victim of sexual abuse, they might have trouble walking or sitting. And that could be because maybe something has happened to their genital area or their anal area. It's causing them so nantikrana. That's it, like in Kuyi or Tinasi, they are complaining so wanya pain or wanya pains. It's possible they could be a victim of sexual abuse. Or they're displaying some type of unusual sexual knowledge or behavior like is inappropriate for their age, meaning so to me because like they just know something and maybe WD5, but the kind of things when you're like, who taught you that? It's possible they've been exposed to something that it could be a form of sexual abuse. Another point that is very important, they said, if a child makes a very strong effort, they want to avoid a specific person, and oftentimes they can't really explain it. I think, especially as a parent, it's very important to say you observe that interaction between that child and the person, where you try to get the child to explain or tell you what has happened between them and the person. It's important as a parent that you keenly observe the interactions your child and other children have and your child and other adults have, because maybe something is going on when you're aware, maybe and so it's important that you are very keen about your child's interactions with other people. Another important one, they said, another warning sign of sexual abuse, they said, if a child contracts a sexually transmitted disease or becomes pregnant, especially if they are under the age of 14. The reason this one, they emphasize it, and they said, if you're a child, especially 14 and under 14, 13, so 11, 10 and going, mostly, you're under the constant supervision of your parents, meaning that when call out, when drive, when call abontina where or parents in baby a walk. So how is it that a child who is 14, who should be under the supervision of their parents, how can they then end up pregnant or getting a sexually transmitted disease? Because a minor cannot consent to sexual activity. So how can these things happen? It means that such a child could be a victim of sexual abuse. Not could be, but is a victim of sexual abuse based on the law. But it doesn't mean that maybe I'll be 17 or 18. It means that if this happens to them or anything, they can't be a victim of sexual abuse. It can be. But the reason this one is particular is because 17 and 18, maybe at that point, otimi kwa bonti or not me pie echo baby or person or drive it or yeah way. So maybe at that point, they're not under the supervision of an adult or a parent. And so that's why this age, it's very particular. So if something like this happens at that age group, we especially observe it and try to understand what has happened. The last type of abuse, and neglect. Neglect, you define it as a failure of a parent, guardian, or other caregiver to provide for a child's basic needs. That basic needs, they consider as shelter, baby akolane beda, eduane, that's food, clothing, and atadi akolane beshe. If you fail to provide that for your children adequately, it can be considered neglect. Neglect can also be said you fail to protect a child from a known risk of danger or harm. And that could be said maybe one who's like they are gonna be harmed. But why should that pass okay or like why you are doing so like you are not gonna do anything about it? That could be considered neglect. There are 4 different types of neglect. There's physical neglect, I mentioned earlier, which is the failure to provide necessary food, clothing, or shelter, or even say you don't provide appropriate supervision for akola. Basically, that's a form of neglect. There's also medical neglect, meaning that maybe the akola never call doctor or yare or something of that nature. The doctor has recommended say maybe in your way na akola take it or your way akola, and then you fail to do that or you ignore it. It can be considered medical neglect. There's also educational neglect, which is a failure to educate a child or to attend to special education needs. And so that's why most times, if a child misses a certain amount of days of school or they are late to school, it's possible that the district or the court can actually recommend for a parent to come to court, either to be fined or even jailed because they're failing, educationally, they are neglecting their child. And of course, there's emotional neglect, meaning that akolani emotional needs, the way they feel loved, the way they feel accepted and they belong and they feel safe, psychologically, you're not providing that type of need for them now. It can be considered neglect. Some warning signs of neglect. One key point, and it said flows. If akola tadia or sheno, like debiana ifi, debiana maybe is inappropriate for the weather, meaning said short sleeve shirt. Maybe when it's hot, long sleeve jacket or something of that nature. Though sometimes children, of course, they wear what they want to wear. So idea it's possible say it could be considered neglect or consistent poor hygiene, meaning say their body, there's some type of body odor. It's possible to neglect. And the interesting thing about it is, as someone who works in the school district, I'm not a teacher, but working in the school district as a school staff, we have platforms that they keep track of every student, and it gives you all the information about a student. And with this, our platform, there are some observations or notes that teachers, staff, administration can make about particular students or can make about students. And so you can see some of these things being notated or being added to this platform. And so it's something to keep aware or keep mind of. They said maybe right now, whenever your kids go to school, you don't really see how they dress. You don't really care. I would say pay attention to that because there's somebody who is definitely observing and keeping track of that. And it could be considered neglect if it's not going in the way it should be going. And so can't abuse of can't the 4 types of abuse of that's physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. So how do these things or how do these forms of abuse, how do they exactly impact children? One particular effect of child abuse and neglect I found interesting while doing my research. They said research has been found said akwala in their or a nipa in their kwala bremu they were abused and are neglected. It can actually lead to poor physical health and development, meaning said they have been linked to higher risk for a range of long-term or future health problems. That could be diabetes, heart attack, high blood pressure. Abuse and neglect can have a higher risk for these things. Psychological problems in childhood and the continued lifespan, meaning in their childhood, because of abuse or neglect, they could suffer from depression, social anxiety, and that these kinds of things can continue into their adulthood. Interpersonal problems. They have problems having good relationships with people because they said maybe abuse, they don't really trust people. And so maybe or person no be and so even in a relationship or marriage, they find it very difficult to or trust it and crawford. And so because of that, it impacts the way they feel satisfied or the way they're able to maintain healthy and positive relationships. And even sexual dysfunction. A child who is abused or sexually abused, even when they grow up, they become an adult and they get married, it can affect the kind of sexual intimacy they have with their partner. Maybe their husband or wife wants to touch them or wants to initiate, sex in a type of way or in a certain way towards them. Sometimes they can be triggered from that because it reminds them of the sexual abuse that they have, that they experienced, or unfortunately that they experienced when they were younger. And so these are key things that are effects of child abuse and neglect. And another key one is the intergenerational transmission of child abuse, meaning that someone who's abused, it's possible someone also it's possible someone also abusing them. Now, of course, that is not in every single case. There are some people who have been abused in their childhood who grow up and they're like, you know what? I don't want my children to go through the same thing. I don't want anybody else to go through the same thing. So they're very key in the way that they interact with their children. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if you've been abused or in your childhood or in any part of your life, it means that Chinchina, you too will be an abuser, but it's a possibility. And so, of course, once we know the kinds of abuse we have, we know the effects of abuse, which way and able to prevent some of these things from happening. And so we're going to look at it from two levels, the family level and the church level. On the family level, one key way to prevent child abuse and neglect is if there's a knowledge of parenting and of child and youth development. What this means is that parents have to be aware of the different stages of child and adolescent development. Meaning, say, if your child is 3 years old, say at 3 years old, this is the way at 5 years old, this is how they're thinking. At 17 years old, this is how they're thinking. Many times, parents who abuse their children, they do it because they have unrealistic expectations of their child's growth and development. At 3 years old, and they expect to say you should be thinking at a 10-year-old level. And so they are disciplining you or abusing the child because they expect that the child should know better. And so if a parent or parents know about child development and now youth development and the different stages they can then be better informed on how they should then respond appropriately to their children or their child's needs. Parental resilience is another key factor for prevention at the family level. What parental resilience is saying is that as a parent, it's very obvious. It said there's a lot of stress. Balancing juma, asore, household chores, friendships, relationships. You're balancing all of these things, and of course, caring for your child. All of these things, it becomes very stressful. And so, if you're not careful, your child will be the one that you put your stress on. Parental resilience is then saying, you should recognize when you are in a stressful situation. To me, you can sit back and say, okay, this moment, now this situation, I feel stressed. I know, right now, once you recognize that, that's when you then try to find ways to minimize the stress. That way, your child is not affected because of it. And then social connections, I think as Ghanaians, this is a key factor for us when it comes to preventing child abuse and neglect. Because of our culture, we value community, we value having social connections. And so when you have such a social connection or such a level of interaction with other people, you're able to have people that will cause through stress more. Now I said, you're able to rely on those people. You're able to go to them and say, oh, me here more on this level. Even on the church level, sanity, you're able to go to them. That way, so our stress now we feel, number one, Senya Unkwana will go through that stress. And number two, people can help you out. That way, it doesn't get to a level I was stress not build it up, and then mano or mano na suffer for stress. And so those are three things that are very, very important in terms of prevention at the family level. On the church level, per the or according to the Adventist Youth Ministry's Child Protection Resources, prevention at the church level, number one, acknowledgement and awareness. What this means is that pastors, ministry leaders, and even parents should acknowledge that child abuse, it can happen in our congregations. Many times, we believe or we like to believe that these things can happen. But when you acknowledge and you are aware, then you make an appropriate plan or you put an appropriate plan into place, which means, or what the Advent or the North American Division recommends, and it said every church should have a written plan in place. It said it proactively protects and children from harm, and it also prevents adults from having potential false allegations against them. And then there's also a willingness. So once the church learns, okay, this kind of abuse I see or something has happened, that the church is willing, so I'm going to report all those incidents to either a child protective service or to law enforcement. Another key to prevention at the church level is training of ministry leaders and volunteers, meaning that every individual, specifically with children's ministry and youth ministry, we make sure that we carefully select those individuals. And we make sure that those individuals, they will go through an appropriate screening process and they will also be trained, meaning that they know the kind of conduct that is expected of them while working with youth and children. And then they also understand the signs and they can recognize the signs of child abuse, and they know the laws that are put into place with it. And a key factor, a key thing that they talked about is the 6-month rule. Meaning, say, Obi Bawa Soria doesn't mean say Nipa Bawa Soria. That means it's hard day no na. You didn't call children's ministry and you didn't call youth ministry. There should be a 6-month, I guess you can call probationary period that you did study Sani Pakrono to learn. So okay, Sani Pakrono, how do they interact with children? How do they interact with youth? Because what they've noticed said is that people who are sexual offenders, or people who choose or deliberately want to harm children, they try to find areas and not places that they think are vulnerable. And so Obawa Sharia, and then nobody is watching the children, nobody is supervising them, and they can easily have access to children. It's very easy that sexual offenders or anything can come and cause harm and damage to your congregation. So it's important that we do involve everybody in the church, but that we are careful, especially when it comes to selecting leaders and volunteers for the children and youth ministries. Watchful supervision is another key to prevention at the church level. Children and youth ministries, that there must be supervision at all times, regardless of the activity. And the North American Division recommends that at minimum, activity for any children ministry or youth ministry, you have to have 2 and penny for and not 2 adults that they're supervising at all times. And of course, this number can be adjusted based on the number of children who are participating, or more age, and then the kind of activity or more. And the reason why watchful supervision is emphasized, they said, number one, it minimizes the risk of inappropriate conduct during a children or youth ministries activity, because if there are 2 adults, or at least 3 adults, 4 adults watching over the children, it's less likely that either there will be some type of inappropriate conduct between a child and a child, or a child and adults. But also, it also minimizes the potential of false accusations being brought against an adult staff member, which means that if 4 adults are always supervising children at every time, or 2 if for whatever reason one of those adults is accused of having inappropriate conduct with a child, and there's a particular incident named, and let's say another adult was there, or a third party or fourth party, it's possible that those people can step in and say, hey, no, we were there, we witnessed this, this is not what happened, or this is not what happened, or this is not how it went. That way, that individual, if there's any form of false allegation that is being formed, we can quickly rectify it. And so that's why it's important at every moment and any child activity, any youth ministry activity, that there is watchful supervision. And so the NAD, once again, has another resource. And so people ask, okay, so if the church gets to know about any kind of abuse or anything that's happened, what do we do with it? How do we go about reporting it? Should we even do something about it? The answer is yes, something should be done. Number one, the North American division, Ed kind of said, do not try to handle the situation yourself and do not talk to the alleged offender. Many times we want to, investigators, and we want to go and handle the situation. But in these cases, because of the sensitivity of these situations, it's important that you do not go to try to investigate it, you don't try to handle it, and you don't go and talk to the person that against a child or a youth, or even any other person in the church. But it's important that the next thing you do when you are aware of such an allegation is that you report it to Child Protective Services, or CPS, or law enforcement. After you have done that, it's important you report it to your church pastor or the first elder. It is then their responsibility as the church administration. So mobile conference, and then the conference will then they may inform the legal counsel of the situation. It's also important that based on the recommendation of Child Protective Services and our CPS, so we wouldn't allow any further contact between Akwalano or the youth and any person that we suspect to have offended or had any type of inappropriate conduct with that child or youth. And it's important that if there is an ongoing investigation of that individual or such an allegation has been made against the individual, that individual, according to the North American division, we must remove them from all church responsibilities until said investigation and said incident has been evaluated. And it's important, especially as a church, is said everybody involved in this ordeal, we handle this situation very confidentially, very discreetly. And business meeting or anything of that nature, we must be very, very, very sensitive in the way we handle this. Number one, to respect the privacy of the child or youth or any other adult who has been affected by this. And of course, if the incident or allegation should be false, it also respects the identity of the person or the person in question. That way, of course, we can properly come to a conclusion. But there are cases where maybe it has to be announced this, and that. But even then, no, you have to be careful with the kind of information that is shared. And then number 6, it's important that if that individual will continue coming to church, the person who we have, who is considered the alleged offender in this case, there's importance of there will be appropriate supervision, meaning so we don't give them a chance to go places by themselves. We have to always keep an eye on them. That way, something else of that nature will not happen. And so those are some of the things that the North American Division Youth Ministry says that we should do when we are aware of allegations against any church member or any member of our church, any child, any youth. And so presentation for today. And so maybe if there's any questions and our contributions, I know it's information may be great, but hopefully I should be free. And so if there's any questions or contribution at this time, I'll be more than willing to take it.
So, mami nyame inshra pa and it's accurate and precise presentation I would amai. Now, my question has to do with emotional abuse. Now, maybe say mami or koda mienu anamiansa. Na debia obo paninua enya effect wo nkaafo no so ana my question no.
Okay. Like Obo Penino and then Ombo and Kolano Makechi and I said it's just like
Penino kwana debia obo.
Okay. Yeah, no, so a bit mania effect on the other children. The reason a bit mania effect, and it said, well, let me start from Penino. It will affect Penino because the Penino be feel said like, or no kwano ye bibia na waka hwasem or obey bibi, but maybe the siblings no one yet. So they can internalize or feel said maybe you love them or you love the other children more than you love them. It can also show other children and say maybe you hate the older child and you don't hate them. It can also show them, or maybe even show them, say you're too aggressive. They might feel sad like my mother or my father, they don't take time to do things and then they're always reacting. And they could also side with their sibling. So on both sides, both parties involved in all of this can be affected. I hope that answers your question, Uncle.
Yes. Why?
It does.
Yeah. Question be say. Okay. Call.
Yo, madam, me pede ebia yehwe how here cultural differences oma you continue yenze maybe under the American system and or abusive, but you don't realize the abusive. And about about it. How Yaba adapt in the Malay big change in that direction. In fact, it's very common there among Ghanaians. We use spare the rod and spoil the child quotation to justify, and that might be all unjustifiable. But this, I think it's based on our cultural area. Able to make a question about that.
Uncle Medasi. This is a very important question, Uncle Ediaba. I think, sir, number one, to prevent it is stuff like this, having a presentations and discussions like this. And you say, yeah, me cry, a bit my friend say abuse. One thing I forgot to say, and it said, as Ghana for, especially as foreigners, we believe in say bahana. We like I hear most of the time say, "Oh, it's not true." The problem is the way that we go about it. The problem is the way that we do it. Most times, because we want the child, we are trying to correct the child, but the way we're going about it is not the right way. For example, maybe because so that means so the benkutano that kind of discipline is not correcting the child. It's a punishment, which then can be termed as physical abuse. So as Ghana for I think it's beyond just being Ghanaians, but as being a Christophone, we know so we are cautioned so we shouldn't act in anger. We are cautioned so we should be slow to speak and be quick to listen. If we put these things into practice, then like I said earlier, and yet sir, in this moment, I have to correct them. Now you have to think, sir, is it correcting them? What is it teaching the child? Or am I acting out of it before? Am I acting out of anger? Am I acting or reacting to the child? What exactly do I want my child to get from this? So if you think about these things in your interactions with your children, then when it gets to points of abuse or anything like that, you know where the line is. The problem is when we act out of anger, we act out of the feeling so we are right and our child is wrong. That is where sometimes it steps over into the boundary of abuse. And like I said, in the state of New York, if you're speaking from New York, if you use physical discipline, which is so you want to correct them, they consider it acceptable. But a more exception is it has to be reasonable. Meaning that because you feel okay, it's reasonable to hit my child with on their head. that doesn't mean that on the law side it could be reasonable. Everything is based on a case-by-case basis. And sometimes, honestly, you might be doing something out of the good of your heart, trying to discipline a child out of the good of your heart, and then it could end up being a court case. They could still find it to be abuse, unfortunately. But like I said, it's a case-by-case basis. It's hard to say, this is going to be considered abuse and this is not, because something crime, I feel say abuse, a court how they could say it's not abuse. I don't know. But I think as a Christopher, if we use those measures of being, slow to be angry, slow to speak, and quick to listen, it helps us in Yekita Hudi, not just with our children, with other people as well. I think there was another question.
Yeah, now maybe sir question efa say obi ewa safunumu no abisu akwara bia sanya watchre no procedure correct say say fasa akwan so, but if it is established say nipa no yes sir, does the church has the right to sanction that person?
That is a very good question, Uncle. If the person is found to be abused, based on the resources that I've read, and based on even number 5, it says to remove the individual from all church responsibilities until evaluated, meaning said it could either be found out as that means that going forward, definitely there's going to be a sanction in place, or something that needs to be done at a better sense, or the appropriate consequences can be put into place for that individual. So my answer would be yes. Said the church, if that is the case, I believe that the church does have the right to sanction them.
Thank you, Mommy.
You're welcome. That's your question for and a contribution for you.
Yeah, but Obi and Kasa may make them observation.
Sure.
In PNP, especially Ghanaian parents in America, you complain also, and I'm about 1,000. But if you how a lot of us raise our kids, you want to Kasa in any way. From the infancy, our reaction to Bibi or baby or in the slap and answer and one in some kind of way. You use a burner, then you train one up. No way you pay would stay deep. You to the will complain there. Oh, that's one time. In a Casada, obviously, and that's what every stage into Burning, then you complain there.
You don't complain.
At times, this is why I dwell on our cultural culture, and we have come out of it, come from it. But when we meet these situations now, we will have to first learn how Ukwafu use improved situations and device circumstances with the training one number. This one number they've managed to raise their kids as well as within the guidelines of the law. And why can't we do so? Why do we think we should be exception? Why should we always go back to somehow maybe people express as a crude way of in building now at the papa or most of the times young culturally you need time and butera you too from any deal but more from their miniature pieces of us. Whatever we feel and all those however small they are or woman share our human being that work custom now so that as time goes on it will serve both of us well.
That's Uncle. Thank you so much for that contribution. The things that you is true. I think there's positive aspects of the American culture and positive aspects of the Ghanaian culture that we should bridge together. But your problem is that we still want to keep the same idea and perception of what we have, of what we believe Ghana is and how we should train a child. We want to keep that same, that same mindset or principles here. And honestly, sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. Like Uncle said, it's important. So when they like for you guys to develop a relationship. I think research shows that, for example, let's say, oh papa, now mommy, all the things your child needs financially, you provide everything, you bring money home, but then you didn't develop a relationship with the child. Most times what happens, I see it in the Ghanaian culture a lot. What happens is they don't have a relationship with you. So most times they either choose not to talk with their parents anymore, or they choose to, have no kind of interaction with them. And most times, the bystanders, because so they need after everything, the papa and mommy I didn't know treating sad then. But it's because we forgot, so even in financially providing for children, we must also emotionally provide. We must also still have a relationship with them, because yes, you provided financially, but when you need that relationship now, or due to a certain point, Uncle Aircon, it's very possible they won't even listen to you. It's possible. So as a child, the only reason why maybe no Tiwa 7 was because they feared you. They thought, they didn't want to do something wrong for you to beat them. They didn't want to do something wrong for you to discipline them. So then they, in a way, pretend to do the right thing. But really, no one say right and wrong as it. It isn't until there may be an adolescent, teenager, or their level of thinking and processing is more advanced, then they start challenging you and they start, why should I do that? Why do I need to even sit? Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to do that? We start to see those things. And so it's important, as Uncle said, that some of the ways to avoid some of the issues we have with our children is simply to have a relationship with them. Start from when they're young. Don't go by the mentality that we have. So as a parent, I'm always right and my child is wrong. Because what happens is it teaches your child then to not respect authority for whatever reason. That is the psychology behind it. It teaches them to not respect authority because they feel, you don't respect the way that they feel. You don't respect the way so no, they feel, then why should I even listen to you? And so as Uncle was saying, is a very important point. Yes, Yaba will be mine. So there's good things here and there's negative things here. There's good things in Ghana for sure. And there's negative things in our culture as well. But how do we bridge them? How do we get to a point that a peaceful, healthy, and positive relationship? That way, we can also all have peaceful and positive and healthy relationships. But because we don't have those relationships at home, then we see some of the issues that come up. And so I think it's a very important contribution at Uncle Ediaba.
Meeting Kasa.
Bachan.
Yo, Nana Maeda was. Yeah, me pacho baby. You can say $3. My men are your presentation. Me banana. A baby extra mono. Na me personal na making. Na mini education biya about child abuse ni adeno. Na no bedi adanse na me bro mo pa. De me dey no stress ne ba bankuta. Na me dey dum wo mo. Ebre asembisi na yekobi sasa me no sha. O ka kire wo mo say me maame de has take bi na bro me. Na ampa sa CPS fo yi ba fie na so me sisa me bankuta me de ka fo ni me sisa nyina disie because on ba we na ya ampa sa de na nam de ye ya ke bia ka sa bia kam da su me dem na through asore education ni adade nyina na ma me hu se ne me bia na ye no enkoyi tebusuafo we ya nko ba bia na yakoto ya funny free and mama ain't taking it serious. Say a quite money stress na ye fan. See I ye near numusio anya try ye the beko ye mano so. Because the baby beman or the nachima no. Or tete me ama me de benkute me true ye na near chi say pow. Na de afedie, me na asma to me. Na see a kwa sorry fia de numre. Ani yakwa asori so me the plaster ata obi abebisa. Enti na afa de ese me ma akora ni twatro. Anam so ko no obi abisa wa. Ka kire wo mo se na wudi agoro na wudi utiri kobo edemu ma etwaaye. Ana wo mo aka na anim sa America fo nkwala so de yentwatro. Obi abisa na no aka, obi abisa afa de maame ba ko bisa no no so ye teacher ni o. Afro ojira wa ka kire am say I can't lie anymore. Me timi twatro biu. Mintimi twatro be say na maame ye. Hey! Afere me na me ho pui. Abusuafo, that was my turning point. If you say waka ya no, ana asesa maame no so taking it serious. Ana nka omo de famra kwan so a, kene so ko ya asam foforo bio. Ti abusuafo mo maye nya abotre, wo mo ho ahomete. There were so many ways I betimi aye a discipline wo mo. Said the waka ya no. Abofra no wa ya ade no wa fom eye bufusem nya obene se wo maame no as a Christian no ko wura dem ne bompa na ka kire rade se wo ma okwan obefa so a oni akora ko no bekasa na akora na age ne phone so atum no wanya oba no back so we asa onyame be ma okasa nyansa ne abotre ana ma akora no so hunu onyi ntum mo disana sade ko ye no so ogitum se ya na enye akora ne gitum a no waka chensenti bia so twen apesa wo de ma no nyesa wo time wo na mo wo pesa wo de etretene no na echine bi wo anye bio so fo obi kan wo se he wono de so wo tene ni wi a owi anu asan no akɔhye dem wasan waso wonsa no abo mpae ama owi anu ha ge akwalakoro so akwala wo be ni se wususu so obefa utirimuka onfa o parent ni tirimuka da onu se wo ya de enye ana waye de watretene no ba yeso ye de me na medikan wo ye no akasa no akekansam wanhwe yi a asam ne bedi akola ne tirimu demo a wo yini nyina na de so e wo ni tirim ususu sa wo ba no wodo wo boa ade a wo de ye ne be atwam no e ya wo no de so wo ni enti Ghana for mekasa Africa for in general say suban no mo ma enya agwe yi pa na ye di e ma no enya amen.
Amen. That's about.
Eme man pacho yeah time na so say obi will question ba ko bi obeti media pa nya sadia na yeah point. Okay, sister man pacho final words bi apese o kan Acheampong pacho betimi akashre.
Senior member I think that it's never too late. I think that sometimes we believe that the way that's the same way we have to also relate to our children or treat our children. But it's not true. I think that as through things like this presentation, more information, more knowledge, sometimes it's your fault. We were not exposed to anything else. And so all we know is what we will do. But now that we know at least if child abuse or neglect, we can start thinking about your interactions with your mom. What do I want my child to take away from it? That's, I think, the key. And so I think I know that they come from the final words. And that's.
Yeah, that's it. Sister Mamijna, Queen's District Women's Ministries here. Queen's District Women Ministry. Bijna muna nemu dia seda amao. Enyumre nyame namo so ame nyina ya yinshira. Enti the district yi ema ni nyina ya kan se nyame nshira obibre onshira. Ma mere so yeda wase pa nyame enamo so e de achede sonkwan ye sister ama odi namo so ama yi nyina so enyumre ya yinshira nti ma mere nyame nshira obibre. Adofo no enyumre so ye ba la yi so Yami on shrine bebre yinim se enyumre adisua yenye no ye de bebobra pa na aboyen na yetimi ene ye ma no atena se asomdwe mu a yenya wo haw bia nyame enkan ho na on shrine sa se enyumre ye da nyina ye ho ase na ye da CB Radio Ghana ase se enyumre jumede kese odi ko YouTube amai ya adisua ehuhia pa yi Yabusiafo ne yanafofo enyumre wentimi ama ne yesre yenka nkyerɛ mo so monko CB Radio Ghana ewo YouTube na omunkuti na ebeboa yinyina yeda mu nyina amase nyame enhira yinyina nti yinyina yebesi yentrase na yabompai pachomi mompai yeda wase yene jadofo pa enyume ensema ehia ewo yasetemu pa na wodi amai yeda wase sister ma enyume wo ma na yenhira edi amai yeso sha oni nebusu yinyina ne enyume wahwe ewo yehu bia yehu atumfo yeso shina na emu mai enyume adofo yehiem wo line yeso yeso de enyume yesiano erade yeso ma yemfanye adwuma yene ye mantemu ye mai eye japade ne achede sonko na wode omamai ne yeso se japa honhon kwantrefo yeso yene omontemu asetnemu omontitiemu yeso cheche ye kwan pano se de be ya setnemu no ye betimi aboa ye mai ne dru ompani fie so a omo ere fie no maka se you ya wofo ema entity epa yeso boa yen na setnemu okrodue mu ha sei no ye mind titie mu no ankofo how ne amane bia amre enyumre ni yeso ne se kan ye ho ye ne abusua nyina ma ya setna wo krum ha no enye de enye kama nhye yesu din ene onyam eda wase enyumre se o kan ye ho de adesua sonko se mai yenim se dane de nyina so ne yehiem wo wanimu a obemi aye nhira se eda wase enyumre se wetie fisi efusa